My name is Mark Sullivan, and the day my wife laughed at me in open court was the day everything finally stopped being quiet. The limestone courtroom in Dubuque smelled like old paper floor cleaner and stale coffee. I was standing alone at the defense table when I heard Linda's voice behind me, sharp, amused, loud enough to carry. "He's too poor to hire a lawyer," she said. "Pathetic." A few people chuckled, then the judge cleared his throat and looked straight at me. "Mr. Sullivan," he said calmly, "you may speak." For a split second, my legs felt like they might fold under me. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them flat against the wood just to steady myself. I could feel every eye in that room on my back, and I knew right then that if I sat down, if I said nothing, they'd remember me forever as the man who proved her right. So I stood there, breathing through my nose, trying to remember how to talk. Only after that moment, after the laugh, after the silence, after the judge's words, did my mind finally catch up with how I'd ended up there. I'm 56 years old, born and raised in eastern Iowa. I've lived in Dubuque my whole life, except for 2 years in the Army when I was 19. I work as a forklift supervisor at a parts warehouse that supplies John Deere equipment. It's not glamorous. My knees ache when the weather changes, and my back reminds me every morning that I'm not 20 anymore. But I've always paid my bills, always showed up, always did what I said I would do. Linda came into my life later. She was 48 when all this started, worked in an insurance office downtown. Smart, organized, always had her nails done. She had a daughter from her first marriage, Ashley, who was 22 and fresh out of community college. Ashley lived on her phone, talked fast, and had a way of rolling her eyes that made you feel about 3 inches tall. When Linda and I started having problems, it wasn't one big explosion. It was 1,000 little things. Money disappearing faster than it should. Cold dinners. Long silences that felt heavier than shouting. When we finally separated, she offered to handle the finances until everything was settled. I trusted her. That was my first mistake. By the time the divorce papers were filed, our joint account at Dutrack Credit Union was nearly empty. The lawyer I called wanted a $7,500 retainer. I had maybe a third of that to my name. So when the court date came, Linda had an attorney in a tailored suit. Ashley sat behind her smirking, and I walked in alone with a folder under my arm. That's when Linda decided to make a show of it. She leaned toward Ashley, but she didn't whisper the way she thought she did. "Look at him," she said. "A forklift supervisor playing lawyer." Ashley laughed quick and sharp, like it was a joke she'd been waiting all morning to hear. I felt my face burn. My father's voice drifted into my head uninvited. He'd worked a factory floor until it shut down in the 80s. When I was a kid, he used to say, "A man can lose a lot of things, Mark. Just don't let them take your spine." Standing there in that courtroom, spine or no spine, I felt small, old, outmatched. The clerk called our case. The judge adjusted his glasses. Linda's lawyer shuffled papers like this was just another Tuesday, and I stared down at the one thing I'd brought with me. A yellow legal pad. The corners were bent. There was a faint coffee stain near the top where my thermos had leaked one night after a late shift. Every page was filled with my handwriting dates, amounts, arrows, notes written in the margins at 2 in the morning when my eyes wouldn't stay open. I didn't have a briefcase. I didn't have legal language memorized, but I had that pad. When the judge asked if both sides were ready, Linda's attorney stood and nodded. When he looked at me, I swallowed and said yes. That's when Linda laughed again. Not loud this time, just enough. "He's representing himself," she said, shaking her head, "because he's broke." The judge shot her a look, but the damage was done. I heard a cough from the gallery, someone shifting in their seat. A man a few rows back shook his head slowly, not mocking, almost sorry. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might come out of my chest. I considered sitting down, letting the professionals talk, signing whatever papers they put in front of me, and going home to an empty house. Instead, I slid the yellow pad onto the table and stood up. I didn't know if my voice would crack. I didn't know if I'd forget everything I'd practiced in my truck before walking in. All I knew was that I was tired of being talked about like I wasn't there. I cleared my throat. "Your Honor," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I'm here without an attorney because I couldn't afford one, but I'm not here unprepared." Linda stopped smiling. Ashley looked up from her phone for the first time. I felt the room change, not in my favor, not yet, but shift, like people were at least willing to listen. As I spoke, my hand still shook, but less. I talked about my job, about the joint account, about how I'd trusted Linda to handle things fairly. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I stuck to facts the way Doris had told me to. When I finished my opening statement, the judge nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Sullivan," he said. "Go on." I took a breath, glanced down at the legal pad, and turned the page. For the first time that morning, no one was laughing. When the judge told me to continue, I felt the weight of the room settle onto my shoulders. Not crushing, just heavy enough to remind me I couldn't afford to stumble. "Your Honor, I said I'm not here because I'm reckless. I'm here because I prepared." Linda's attorney shifted in his seat. Not much, just enough that I noticed. I slid the yellow legal pad a little closer to me and flipped to the first page. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt. Dates down the left margin, dollar amounts circled, little arrows I'd drawn late at night, trying to make sense of where everything went. "I worked the early shift at the warehouse," I said, 4 a.m. to 2:30. After that, I didn't go home. I went to the library. The Dubuque Public Library sits a few blocks from the river. Old brick building. Smells like dust and carpet cleaner. The fluorescent lights hum in a way you don't notice until you're there alone past dinner time trying to keep your eyes open. I didn't say all that out loud in court, but I felt it as I spoke. The long tables, the copier that jammed every third page, my reflection in the dark window looking older than I remembered. "I didn't know the law," I said, so I read it. Linda snorted quietly. The judge gave her a look. I went on. I read Iowa Family Court Guidelines. I learned what joint assets are. I learned what they're not. And I learned that dates matter. I paused just long enough to let that settle. A few weeks into it, I almost quit. I was sitting in my truck in the library parking lot, hands on the steering wheel, staring at a stack of copies I didn't understand yet. It was late. My back hurt. My phone buzzed with a message from Ashley, something about how I should just sign and move on. That was the night I went to the VFW instead of home. It was fish fry night, smelled like grease and coffee, the same group of men at the same tables telling the same stories they'd told for years. I wasn't looking for help. I just needed to be around people who didn't see me as a problem to be solved. That's when Doris sat down across from me. She was 67 hair, pulled back tight glasses on a chain around her neck. I'd seen her there before, always with a notebook, always listening more than talking. She'd worked as a legal secretary for 30 years before retiring. She looked at the paper spread in front of me and said, "Divorce." I nodded. She took a sip of her coffee, leaned closer, and tapped one page with her finger. "They have the money," she said quietly. "You have the paper trail. Paper trail always wins." That was it. No speech, no sympathy, just a fact. Back in the courtroom, I felt her voice steady me. I requested official statements from DuTrack Credit Union, I said, holding up a stapled packet. Not screenshots, not summaries. Original statements with headers, dates, and reference numbers. Linda's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we object. These appear to be photocopies. There's no proof they haven't been altered." My stomach dropped. For a second, I felt that same parking lot panic rise up again. The judge looked at me. "Mr. Sullivan." I swallowed. "I requested them directly from the bank," I said. "They were mailed to my address. The account numbers and reference codes match what the bank provided in writing." I handed copies to the clerk. My hand shook as I did it. I hated that they could see that, but I kept talking. "These statements show withdrawals over a 6-month period," I said. "Not one large transfer, multiple smaller ones." "Objection," the lawyer said. "Speculation." "I'm stating what the statements show," I replied before I could stop myself. The judge raised a hand. "I'll allow it. Continue." I exhaled slowly and nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." I pointed to the dates. These withdrawals began 2 weeks after we separated. They increased right before this court date. Linda crossed her arms. Ashley stared at me now, no phone in her hand. I could feel the room leaning in, not rooting for me, just paying attention. "I didn't understand why at first," I said. "Groceries cost money, gas costs money." But then I noticed something. I flipped the page. Every withdrawal lined up with a transfer. Different app, different description, same timing. Linda's lawyer leaned forward. "Your Honor, we need a recess to review." "No," the judge said flatly. "We're not recessing yet." I felt a flicker of something then. Not confidence, relief. I tapped the paper once, just once, to keep my place. "I can show the exact day the money left our joint account," I said, "and I can show where it went next." My voice didn't waver that time. The judge nodded. Go on. I looked down at the next page of my legal pad, the one I'd circled in red weeks ago, the one that had kept me awake more nights than I could count. And that's where things stop looking like household expenses, I said, and start looking like something else. I lifted my eyes and met Linda's for the first time that morning. I didn't want to look at Linda, but I did anyway. Her smile was gone now. She sat very still, lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the papers in front of her, as if they might rearrange themselves if she stared long enough. I need to explain how I almost missed this, I said, turning back to the judge. Because I did, for weeks. I told them about the night I nearly signed the settlement. It was a Thursday, rain coming down hard enough to rattle the gutters. I was sitting at my kitchen table with the paperwork spread out in front of me, the house quiet, in that way that feels louder than noise. The offer looked clean, simple. It would have been over in a week. Ashley had texted me earlier that day. You're just dragging this out. Mom needs closure. Linda followed up with an email, polite, professional, like she was writing to a stranger. This is fair, Mark. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. I was tired, I said quietly. Tired of reading, tired of not sleeping, tired of feeling like the dumbest person in the room. I paused. Let that sit. I told myself I didn't need to understand everything, that I should just trust the process. That's the trap. Linda shifted in her seat. They didn't take everything at once, I said. They didn't need to. Small withdrawals don't trigger alarms. They don't feel like theft when you're married. They feel like life. I turned another page on the legal pad. But the pattern mattered, I said. The timing mattered, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I explained how I'd gone back to the library with a different mindset, not looking for laws anymore, looking for intent. I learned that moving money isn't illegal by itself, I said, but moving it to keep it from being counted, that's something else. Linda's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, this is a legal conclusion. I'm explaining what I researched. I said, my voice tight but controlled. I'm not a lawyer. That's why I brought the documents. The judge nodded once. Proceed, Mr. Sullivan, but stick to facts. Yes, sir. I told them about calling DuTrack, about sitting on hold for 30 minutes with the phone wedged between my shoulder and ear while I wrote down names and extension numbers, about asking the same question 3 different ways until someone finally understood what I was trying to see. They confirmed the statements I said, and they confirmed the dates. I handed up another packet, certified copies this time, bank stamps, official language that looked nothing like my handwriting. Linda's attorney took them flipping through faster than he probably should have. These transfers, I said, line up with something else. I hesitated. My mouth went dry. This was the part that scared me, not because it wasn't true, but because saying it out loud made it real. A deposit was placed on a vehicle, I said, 2 days after one of the larger withdrawals. Ashley's head snapped up. Linda spoke for the first time. That's not what this is. The judge raised a hand. Mrs. Sullivan, you'll have a chance to respond. Let him finish. I swallowed. I didn't know about the vehicle at first. I found out by accident. I explained how I'd seen a receipt in the glove compartment when Ashley borrowed my truck one afternoon before the separation was final, how the dealership name stuck with me because it was on the edge of town, the kind of place with pennants flapping in the wind. I went there, I said, not to accuse anyone, just to ask a question. The courtroom was silent now, no coughing, no shifting. They couldn't tell me much, I said, but they confirmed a deposit, and they confirmed the name on the paperwork. I didn't say the name yet. Linda's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, this is hearsay. We haven't seen any. I have it, I said louder than I meant to. I stopped myself, took a breath. I have the documentation. I handed over the next exhibit. My hands were shaking again. I hated that, but I kept going. After the judge requested verified statements, I said I returned to the bank and requested transaction confirmations tied to external transfers. I didn't know if they'd give them to me. They did, the judge said quietly, flipping through the pages. I nodded. They did. I pointed to the highlighted section. That's when I realized this wasn't about groceries, or bills, or helping out with school. I looked straight at Linda then. This was about moving money before the court could see it. She stared back at me, eyes hard now. Ashley's face had gone pale. She looked at her mother, then back at the papers like she was trying to find the part where this stopped being about her. I turned back to the judge. And that's when I understood something else I said. They didn't just underestimate me. They assumed I'd quit. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. I flipped to the next page on the legal pad, the one with the red circle. And that's where the money went, I said. Exactly where they thought I wouldn't look. I felt my heart thudding in my ears as I took the next step. This was the part where I could lose the room if I rushed it, or lose myself if I didn't. Your Honor, I said I'd like to walk through the transfers. The judge nodded. Do it carefully. I held up the first statement. On March 14th, $1,850 was withdrawn from our joint account at DuTrack. The description says household. 2 days later, that exact amount appears in a Venmo transfer. Linda's attorney stood. Objection. Venmo records aren't before the court. They are now, I said, handing over another packet, downloaded directly from the account with transaction IDs. The judge accepted them. Proceed. My mouth was dry. I forced myself to keep my pace steady. On April 2nd, there's a withdrawal of $4,200, I continued. Again, marked household. The next day, there's a Zelle transfer. Ashley's foot started bouncing under the table. I could see it from where I stood. These transfers weren't random, I said. They line up with payments to a used car dealership on Highway 20. Linda's attorney leaned forward. Mr. Sullivan, you're not qualified to interpret bank records. I felt my face flush. My first instinct was to snap back. Instead, I remembered Doris's voice, paper trail. I'm not interpreting, I said, keeping my eyes on the judge. I'm matching dates and amounts. The lawyer wasn't done. And how do we know these documents weren't altered? The room seemed to tilt. For a second, I couldn't feel my feet. I swallowed. Because they were provided directly by the bank, I said, and because the reference numbers match across statements. I handed up one last page. The bank confirmed the external destinations. The judge studied it, long enough that my palms started to sweat. Mr. Sullivan, he said, finally continue. I nodded. The vehicle purchased was a white SUV. The title was filed 2 days after the deposit. Linda shook her head slowly. This is ridiculous. The judge's gaze snapped to her. You'll have your turn. I took a breath. The title lists one owner. I paused, let the silence stretch. Ashley Sullivan. Her head jerked up. That's not... She stopped herself. Linda's attorney jumped in. Your Honor, we need a recess to review these documents. No, the judge said, voice firm. We're past the point of recesses. I felt something loosen in my chest. These assets were moved out of a joint account, I said, and placed in a name that wouldn't be counted. The clerk's typing slowed. Someone in the gallery inhaled sharply. I felt dizzy for a moment. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. I'm not saying this to punish anyone, I said quietly. I'm saying it because it happened. Linda stared straight ahead now, jaw clenched. Ashley looked like she might be sick. I glanced down at my legal pad one last time, then back up. Your Honor, I said the next exhibit isn't a number. I let my hand rest on the folder. It's her own words. I could hear my own breathing as I opened the folder. Slow, measured. Like Doris had told me, don't rush the truth. Let it land. These are text messages, I said, between Linda and Ashley. Linda's attorney stood halfway out of his chair. Your Honor. The judge held up a hand. Sit down. Let him finish. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not confidence. Something quieter, like resignation mixed with relief. I didn't hack anything I said. These were provided voluntarily during discovery. Same phone numbers. Same dates. I handed copies to the clerk, then to the judge. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the lights overhead. I read the first one aloud. March 16th. Linda to Ashley. Move it before the court freezes accounts. Ashley's shoulders stiffened. I kept my voice even. April 3rd, Linda to Ashley. Do it fast. Don't ask questions. Linda shook her head almost imperceptibly. You're twisting this. I looked at the judge. I'm reading it. He nodded. Continue. I did. April 4th. Ashley replies, okay, it's done. That was when something changed. Ashley turned and looked at her mother, not angry, not accusing, just confused, like she'd stepped into a room she didn't know existed until the lights came on. I didn't think she started, then stopped. Linda shot her a warning glance. Too late. The judge leaned forward. Miss Sullivan, he said gently, you don't need to speak unless you're asked. Ashley nodded, eyes down. Linda's attorney tried again. Your Honor, these messages could be interpreted in many ways. The judge didn't look at him. They can. but combined with the financial trail, they're very clear. I swallowed hard. My throat burned. They said I was too poor to hire a lawyer, I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It just came out. And they were right. I couldn't. Linda looked at me then. Really looked at me. But I had time. I continued. And I had the truth. And I believed this court would listen. The judge sat back. The silence felt heavy, dense, like the air before a storm. Counsel, he said to Linda's attorney, we are past the point of recesses. The lawyer opened his mouth, closed it. The judge turned to Linda. Mrs. Sullivan, the court finds that marital assets were intentionally moved to avoid equitable distribution. Linda's face drained of color. These transfers, the judge continued, were not incidental. They were coordinated, and they involved a third party whose name appears on a titled asset purchased during the separation. Ashley stared at the table. Her hands were clenched so tight, her knuckles had gone white. The court orders an adjustment to the proposed settlement, the judge said. Funds equal to the transferred amounts will be restored through offset. Claims beyond that are denied. He paused. And I want to be clear, he added, this court does not look favorably on attempts to manipulate outcomes. Linda didn't speak. She couldn't. I felt my knees go weak as I sat down. My heart was racing, but underneath it was something else. Relief. Not triumph. Just relief. People in the gallery shifted. A man behind me murmured something I couldn't make out. Someone exhaled. When the judge banged his gavel, the sound echoed longer than it should have. Court recessed. I walked out into the hallway on unsteady legs. The walls were cool limestone. My reflection in the glass case holding old photographs looked different somehow. Not younger, just straighter. I passed Linda and Ashley without a word. Ashley paused. For half a second, she looked back at her mother. There was something in her eyes, then realization maybe, or regret. Not enough to undo anything, just enough to know it wasn't simple anymore. I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped outside. The air felt different, lighter. Winning in court was one thing. Going home was another. The cold hit my face the moment I stepped outside, sharp and clean like Iowa, reminding me I was still alive. It was late afternoon. The sun hung low over the Mississippi, throwing pale gold across the parking lot. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to just breathing. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I noticed that before anything else. I didn't go straight home. I drove to Casey's on Locust Street, the one I'd stopped at 1,000 times on my way to work. Same bell on the door, same smell of coffee and pizza grease. I poured myself a cup black and wrapped my hands around it like it was something solid I could trust. A man about my father's age nodded at me from the counter. Veteran's cap, gray mustache. Rough day, he asked. I thought about it, then shook my head. Long one. He smiled like he understood exactly what that meant. I sat in my truck for a while after that engine-off coffee cooling between my palms. The courthouse loomed in the distance, quiet now, like nothing important had happened there at all. Funny how places do that, swallow your worst moments and move on without you. I thought about how close I'd come to giving up, how easy it would have been to sign those papers on that rainy Thursday and tell myself peace was worth the price, how ashamed I'd felt walking into that courtroom alone. I thought about Linda, about Ashley, about that look Ashley gave her mother right before everything fell apart. Not hatred, not forgiveness, just the sudden understanding that actions don't stay theoretical forever. And I thought about my dad. He used to say dignity wasn't something anyone could give you. It was something you decided to keep, even when it cost you sleep, pride, and comfort, especially then. That night, I went to the VFW. Fish fry was over, but a few of the regulars were still there. Doris sat at the same table she always did, a mug of coffee in front of her. When she saw me, she didn't ask questions. She just looked at my face. Well, she said. I nodded. Paper trail. She smiled. Small, satisfied. Told you. One of the old guys nearby leaned over. You the fellow from court today. I hesitated, then nodded again. He raised his mug. Good work, son. A man's not measured by his wallet. I didn't say anything back. I didn't need to. When I finally went home, the house was still quiet. Too quiet. That part didn't magically fix itself. Some losses don't get reversed by a gavel. But as I set my keys on the counter, I realized something important. They hadn't taken my voice. They hadn't taken my spine. And they hadn't rewritten my story. If there's one thing I learned standing alone in that courtroom, it's this: sometimes the loudest power isn't money or lawyers or who laughs the hardest. Sometimes it's just standing up when everyone expects you to sit down and disappear. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever been underestimated, talked over, or quietly pushed into a corner, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not powerless. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, told straight and honest, I hope you'll stick around. Take care of each other.